The December wind cut through Willowbrook Station like a frozen blade, carrying with it the sound of distant train whistles and broken dreams. Emma Clarke stood on the wooden platform clutching two small hands, her pregnant belly straining against her worn wool coat as she watched Henry Mitchell's face transform from anticipation to disgust. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The 3-year-old twins, Lucy and Sam, pressed close to their mother's legs, sensing the tension in the air like animals before a storm. What Henry saw wasn't the refined lady he'd pictured from their brief correspondence, but a woman clearly with child, exhausted from days of travel, accompanied by 2 children he'd never been told about. "This is not what we agreed upon," Henry said, his voice sharp enough to shatter the December morning. His eyes moved from Emma's swollen belly to the children, then back to her face with undisguised revulsion. "You failed to mention certain complications in your letters, Miss Clarke. Our arrangement is void." Emma's world collapsed in that moment, standing there on the platform with nowhere to go and winter bearing down on them like a hungry wolf. She had sold everything she owned back in Ohio, used every last penny for train tickets west, carrying nothing but hope and a battered suitcase containing their meager belongings. The twins looked up at her with wide, trusting eyes that broke her heart, while other passengers stepped around them as if they were obstacles to be avoided rather than human beings in desperate need. Thomas Harrison had been sweeping the same section of platform for the past 10 minutes, pretending not to watch the scene unfolding near the depot entrance. As station master of Willowbrook, he'd witnessed countless arrivals and departures, seeing dreams fulfilled and shattered with equal measure, but something about this particular morning felt different. The woman with the children possessed a quiet dignity that reminded him of his late mother. The way she held her shoulders straight despite obvious exhaustion, how she spoke softly to calm the twins even as her own world crumbled around her. At 35 years old, Thomas had long ago accepted his solitary existence. He lived alone in the small cottage behind the station, tending to train schedules and passenger needs with methodical precision. His days began before dawn and ended well after sunset, filled with the comforting routine of maintenance work, paperwork, and the occasional friendly conversation with travelers passing through. The townspeople respected him for his reliability and quiet competence, but few knew the loneliness that settled over him each evening like a familiar, unwelcome companion. His own story was simple enough, though few bothered to ask. Born in Willowbrook to parents who died in a typhoid outbreak when he was barely 20, Thomas had inherited both the cottage and the station master position from his father. He'd never married, partly from shyness and partly because the right woman had never come along. The years had passed quietly, marked only by the regular arrival and departure of trains carrying other people toward their destinies, while he remained rooted in place like an old oak tree. The December morning had started like any other, with Thomas checking the telegraph for schedule changes and ensuring the platform was clear of ice. The 8:15 westbound from Denver was running on time, carrying its usual mixture of drummers, settlers, and those seeking fresh starts in the growing territories beyond Colorado. He'd noticed the woman and children immediately when they disembarked, something about their careful movements and the way they stayed close together, suggesting people who'd learned to depend only on each other. Henry Mitchell was well known in Willowbrook as a successful merchant who owned the largest general store in town. At 42, he'd built a comfortable life through shrewd business dealings and careful investments, but he remained a bachelor who'd grown tired of cooking his own meals and managing his own household. His decision to seek a mail-order bride had been purely practical, a business arrangement designed to provide him with domestic convenience and social respectability. The idea of taking on someone else's children, especially with another on the way, violated every practical consideration that had guided his adult life. I specifically requested a woman of good character and neat appearance, Henry continued, his voice rising enough to draw stares from other passengers. Someone capable of managing a household and presenting a respectable image in the community. This situation is entirely unacceptable. Emma's face flushed with humiliation, but her voice remained steady. Mr. Mitchell, I understand this is not what you expected, but we have traveled a great distance based on your correspondence. Surely we can discuss arrangements that might be suitable for both parties. There is nothing to discuss, Henry replied curtly. I cannot be seen associating with a woman in your condition, nor can I take responsibility for children that are not my own. You have misrepresented yourself gravely, and I will not be held accountable for your deception. Little Sam tugged at his mother's coat, his young voice piping up in the frigid air. Mama, why is the man angry? Are we going to live in the pretty house you told us about? Emma knelt down despite her bulk, gathering both children close to her. We'll figure something out, sweetheart. Don't worry about the angry man. But Thomas could see the fear creeping into her eyes as she looked around the nearly empty platform, calculating options that grew fewer by the minute. Thomas had heard enough. He set down his broom and approached the group, his boots echoing on the wooden planks. Years of dealing with difficult passengers had taught him to project calm authority even when his heart was racing, and something about this woman's plight had stirred protective instincts he didn't know he possessed. Excuse me, Thomas said politely, touching the brim of his cap. Is there some difficulty here that I might help resolve? Henry turned toward him with obvious irritation. This is a private matter, Harrison, nothing that concerns the railroad. Well now, Thomas replied mildly, anyone stranded on my platform in December weather is certainly my concern. Station policy requires that I ensure all passengers have proper accommodations before the next storm moves in. It was a gentle lie, but one delivered with enough authority to give Henry pause. Thomas had noticed the darkening clouds on the western horizon and could feel the pressure drop that usually preceded heavy snow. His years in Colorado had taught him to read weather signs with the same precision he read train schedules, and tonight promised to bring the kind of blizzard that could trap travelers for days. Emma looked up at Thomas with a mixture of hope and wariness. In her experience, men who offered help usually expected something in return, and her current situation left her with little to bargain with except her dignity. But there was something different about this man's eyes, a kindness that seemed genuine rather than calculated. His face was weathered but honest, with laugh lines that suggested someone who found joy in simple things. I'm Thomas Harrison Station Master here in Willowbrook, he said, addressing Emma directly. These must be your children. Yes, sir, Emma replied carefully. This is Lucy and Sam. I'm Emma Clarke, and we've just arrived from Ohio. Ohio's a long way to travel, especially in winter, Thomas observed. I imagine you could use some hot coffee and a warm place to sit while you sort out your plans. Henry Mitchell's face reddened with indignation. Harrison, I'll thank you not to interfere in matters that don't concern you. This woman has attempted to deceive me regarding her circumstances, and I am well within my rights to refuse her. Oh, I'm not interfering, Thomas said pleasantly. Just doing my job. Station regulations require that I offer assistance to any passenger who appears to be in distress. He paused, studying Henry with the sort of calm assessment usually reserved for mechanical problems. Though I am curious about one thing, Mitchell. How exactly did this lady deceive you? The question hung in the cold air like a challenge. Henry shifted uncomfortably, realizing that his complaints about Emma's pregnancy and children would sound petty and cruel to anyone listening. Several other passengers had gathered nearby, drawn by the raised voices and obvious tension. The specifics are none of your business, Henry said stiffly. Suffice it to say that certain important details were omitted from our correspondence. Thomas nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this information. I see. So you're saying that a woman traveled halfway across the country with 2 small children, spending what were probably her last dollars on train tickets, just to deceive you about something. The logical absurdity of Henry's position was becoming apparent to everyone within earshot. Emma had clearly invested everything in this journey, which hardly suggested someone engaged in casual deception. Meanwhile, Henry's behavior was painting him as the sort of man who would abandon a pregnant woman and her children in the middle of winter over some perceived slight. Perhaps, Thomas continued conversationally, the real issue is that you got cold feet about taking on more responsibility than you bargained for, which would be understandable, mind you. Not every man is cut out for family life. Henry's face went from red to purple. How dare you suggest that I lack courage? I am a respected businessman in this community, and I will not be lectured by a common railroad employee about my personal decisions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Oh, I wasn't lecturing, Thomas replied mildly. Just making an observation about courage. Takes a special kind of man to turn away a lady and her children in December. Takes an even more special kind to do it publicly, where everyone can see exactly what sort of character he has. The small crowd that had gathered was beginning to murmur among themselves, and Henry could feel the shift in public opinion. What had started as his righteous rejection of an unsuitable arrangement was beginning to look like heartless abandonment of a vulnerable family. In a town the size of Willowbrook, reputation mattered more than money, and Thomas had skillfully maneuvered him into an indefensible position. This is ridiculous, Henry sputtered. I refuse to be manipulated by false sentiment and moral posturing. My decision stands. He turned back to Emma with a final glare. You have exactly 1 hour to remove yourself and your belongings from my sight, or I will have Sheriff Carter escort you to the town limits. With that, Henry Mitchell stormed off toward his carriage, leaving Emma and the children standing alone on the platform with Thomas. The crowd began to disperse, some casting sympathetic glances at the abandoned family, others hurrying away to avoid involvement in what promised to be an uncomfortable situation. Emma watched Henry's retreat with a mixture of relief and terror. She was free from an arrangement that had already proven itself disastrous, but she was also stranded in an unknown town with 2 children, another baby on the way, and nowhere to go. The wind picked up, cutting through her thin coat and reminding her that winter in Colorado was not forgiving to those without shelter. Thank you for intervening, she said quietly to Thomas, though I'm not sure it improved our situation much. Thomas picked up her battered suitcase without being asked. Well now, that depends on how you look at it. Seems to me you're better off discovering Mitchell's true character before you committed to anything permanent. He gestured toward the station building. Why don't we get you and the children inside where it's warm? We can sort out the rest from there. Lucy and Sam had been unusually quiet during the confrontation, but now Sam spoke up with the brutal honesty of a 3-year-old. Mama, I don't like the angry man. He has mean eyes. Hush now, Emma said automatically, but Thomas chuckled. Smart boy, he said, looking down at Sam with approval. Always trust your instincts about people. They're usually right. As they walked toward the station building, Thomas found himself studying Emma more carefully. Despite her obvious exhaustion and current predicament, she carried herself with a grace that spoke of better circumstances in her past. Her dress, though worn and travel-stained, had been well made originally, and her speech suggested education beyond what he might have expected from someone answering mail-order bride advertisements. The station waiting room was warm and welcoming. After the bitter cold of the platform, Thomas had installed a large pot-bellied stove the previous autumn, and the space was furnished with comfortable chairs and benches that made long waits more bearable. Emma sank gratefully into one of the chairs while Lucy and Sam pressed their faces against the windows, watching the activity on the platform with the endless curiosity of children. "Coffee?" Thomas offered, already moving toward the small kitchen area he'd set up in the back of the building. "That would be wonderful," Emma replied, "if it's not too much trouble." "No trouble at all. I was just about to make a pot anyway." Thomas busied himself with the familiar routine of coffee preparation, stealing glances at his unexpected guests. The children were well behaved but obviously tired, and Emma looked as though she hadn't slept properly in days. When he returned, with steaming mugs and a cup of warm milk for each child, Emma accepted hers with hands that trembled slightly from cold and exhaustion. The first sip brought color back to her cheeks, and Thomas felt an unexpected surge of satisfaction at this small improvement in her condition. "Might I ask," he said carefully, settling into a chair across from her, "what brought you all the way from Ohio to answer Mitchell's advertisement? Not that it's any of my business, mind you, but it's a long journey to make on uncertain prospects." Emma was quiet for a long moment, watching the twins who had curled up together on a nearby bench like exhausted puppies. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My husband died 8 months ago. Influenza. We had a small farm outside Columbus, but without his income, I couldn't keep up with the payments. The bank foreclosed in October." She paused, gathering strength for the rest of the story. "I had some savings, enough for train tickets and a few weeks of basic expenses, but not enough to start over anywhere expensive. When I saw Mr. Mitchell's advertisement seeking a wife to help manage his household, it seemed like the answer to our prayers." Thomas nodded, understanding more than she probably realized. He'd seen plenty of families broken by circumstances beyond their control, people forced to make desperate choices between impossible alternatives. The westward trains carried thousands of such stories, people fleeing poverty, loss, or simply the absence of opportunity in the places they'd called home. The advertisement mentioned that he owned a successful business and was looking for someone to help create a proper home. Emma continued, "I thought perhaps someone who appreciated domestic skills might not object to children. I was wrong, obviously." "About the children, maybe," Thomas said gently. "But you weren't wrong about appreciating domestic skills. Any man with sense would count himself lucky to have someone willing to work as partners in building a life together." Emma looked at him with surprise, unused to having her contributions valued rather than seen as burdens to be tolerated. "You're very kind, Mr. Harrison, but I think my current situation speaks for itself about my market value as a prospective wife." "Now there's where you're wrong," Thomas said firmly. "Your situation speaks to Mitchell's character, not yours. Takes courage to travel across the country with 2 small children and another on the way. Takes love to put their needs ahead of your own comfort. Takes strength to keep going when everything falls apart." The sincerity in his voice caught Emma off guard. She was accustomed to men who measured women by their convenience or beauty, not their character or determination. Thomas Harrison spoke as though he genuinely respected what she'd been through, rather than pitying her for it. "You don't know anything about me," she said softly. "For all you know, I could be exactly the sort of woman Mr. Mitchell suggested. Perhaps I did deceive him about my circumstances." Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering this. Then he smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face into something much younger and warmer. "Well, I reckon I know a few things. I know you've kept those children clean and well-behaved, despite traveling for days on crowded trains. I know you speak to them with patience, even when you're scared and exhausted. I know you thanked me for helping, even though I haven't actually solved any of your problems yet." He gestured toward Lucy and Sam, who had fallen asleep cuddled together on the bench. "And I know that children that age don't trust easily. The way they stay close to you, the way they look to you for comfort, that tells me everything I need to know about what kind of mother you are." Emma felt tears threatening and looked away, overwhelmed by this unexpected kindness from a stranger. "You're very observant, Mr. Harrison. Comes with the job," Thomas replied. "You learn to read people pretty quickly when you're responsible for keeping a station running smoothly. Can't afford to misjudge character when you're dealing with hundreds of passengers every month." The wind outside was picking up, rattling the windows and reminding them both that afternoon was fading into evening. Thomas glanced at the clock on the wall and realized they'd been talking for over an hour. The next train heading east wouldn't arrive until tomorrow morning, and the westbound wouldn't return for 3 days. "Mrs. Clarke," he said carefully, "I don't want to presume anything about your plans, but if you're thinking of taking the next train out of Willowbrook, you should know that we're likely to have a significant storm tonight. The evening train has already been delayed, and there's a good chance it won't run at all tomorrow." Emma's face went pale. "How long might we be stranded?" "Hard to say for certain. Could be a day, could be a week. Depends on how much snow we get and how quickly the crews can clear the tracks." Thomas paused, weighing his next words carefully. "In the meantime, you'll need somewhere warm to stay. The hotel is expensive and not particularly welcoming to families with small children. Mrs. Ashford, who runs it, has very specific ideas about appropriate guests." The implication was clear. Even if Emma could afford hotel rates, which Thomas doubted, Victoria Ashford was unlikely to welcome a pregnant woman with 2 small children, especially one who'd been publicly rejected by Henry Mitchell. News traveled fast in a town like Willowbrook, and Emma's situation was exactly the sort of scandal that Victoria took pleasure in rejecting from her establishment. "Is there anywhere else?" Emma asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Thomas took a deep breath, knowing he was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "There's the cottage behind the station. It's small, but it's warm and clean. I built an extra room onto it last year, thinking I might eventually need space for visitors, or maybe an assistant." He met her eyes directly. "You and the children are welcome to use it for as long as you need." Emma stared at him in shock. "Mr. Harrison, I couldn't possibly accept such generosity from a stranger. What would people think? What would you expect in return?" The questions were reasonable, even necessary given her vulnerable position. Thomas had expected them and appreciated that Emma was smart enough to be cautious about offers that seemed too good to be true. "What people think is their business," he said simply. "As for what I'd expect, nothing more than you'd offer any neighbor who helped you out of a tight spot. Maybe some help with cooking if you're inclined, since I'm not much good at anything beyond coffee and beans, but that would be entirely up to you." He stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. "Truth is, Mrs. Clarke, I've been alone in that cottage for 15 years. Having voices around the place, especially children's voices, would be more of a gift to me than a burden. Sometimes the silence gets so thick you could cut it with a knife." Emma studied his profile against the window, trying to understand what sort of man would make such an offer to strangers. In her experience, men always wanted something in return for their kindness, whether they admitted it up front or not. But Thomas Harrison seemed genuinely concerned for their welfare, without any apparent ulterior motive. "You don't know anything about us," she said again. "We could be thieves or worse. You could wake up tomorrow to find your belongings gone and your trust betrayed." Thomas turned back to her with that same gentle smile. "Could be, but I've been watching people for 35 years, and I've gotten pretty good at spotting the ones to worry about. Besides," he added, glancing at the sleeping children, "I figure anyone traveling with 2 3-year-olds isn't planning to make a quick getaway." Despite everything, Emma found herself smiling for the first time in weeks. "You make a valid point, Mr. Harrison." "Tom," he corrected. "If we're going to be neighbors, even temporarily, we might as well skip the formalities." Emma felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. For the first time since her husband's death, Someone was treating her as an equal rather than a charity case or a burden to be tolerated. Tom Harrison spoke to her as though her opinions mattered, as though she had something valuable to contribute to any arrangement between them. The first snowflakes began to fall outside, swirling past the windows in the lamplight. Soon the storm would make any other options impossible, but Emma realized she was no longer afraid. Something about Tom's quiet competence and genuine kindness made her feel safer than she had in months. "If you're certain about your offer," she said slowly, "we would be very grateful for shelter until the weather clears and we can make proper arrangements." "I'm certain," Tom replied, and something in his voice suggested this decision would change both their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. "Welcome to Willowbrook, Emma Clarke. I have a feeling you're going to fit in just fine." Outside, the snow began to fall in earnest, as if the sky itself was blessing this unexpected meeting between two lonely souls who had found each other just when they needed it most. The storm that was coming would strand them together for days, giving them time to discover that sometimes the best things in life arrive disguised as disasters, and that family can be found in the most unexpected places. The blizzard that descended upon Willowbrook that night proved to be one of the worst in recent memory, dumping nearly 2 feet of snow across the valley and making travel impossible for anyone foolish enough to venture outside. Emma woke in the small but comfortable guest room of Tom's cottage to the sound of wind howling around the eaves and the soft murmur of voices from the kitchen. Through the frost-covered window, she could see nothing but white, as if the world beyond had simply ceased to exist. The events of the previous day felt almost dreamlike in the gray morning light. Henry Mitchell's cruel rejection, Tom Harrison's unexpected kindness, and her decision to accept shelter from a man she'd known for barely an hour all seemed like the sort of desperate choices that belonged to someone else's life. But the warm quilt tucked around her shoulders and the smell of bacon drifting from the kitchen reminded her that this strange new reality was indeed her own. Emma dressed quickly in her best remaining dress, a dark blue wool that had seen better days but still maintained some semblance of respectability. Her pregnancy was becoming more obvious each day, and she smoothed the fabric self-consciously before venturing into the main room of the cottage. What she found there stopped her in her tracks. Tom stood at the stove flipping pancakes while Lucy and Sam sat at the small wooden table, their faces bright with laughter as he told them some elaborate story about the adventures of a brave little train engine. The children had shed their usual wariness, chattering freely with their host as if they'd known him for years rather than hours. The scene was so perfectly domestic that Emma felt a sharp pang of loss for the life she'd once imagined having with her late husband. "Morning," Tom said, glancing up with a smile that transformed his weathered features. "Hope you slept well. The storm's still going strong, but we're snug as bugs in here." "Very well, thank you," Emma replied, though she'd actually spent much of the night lying awake, wondering what she'd gotten herself into. "You didn't need to cook for us. I could have managed breakfast." "Nonsense," Tom said, sliding perfectly golden pancakes onto a plate. "You're guests, and besides, I enjoy the company." Been a long time since this kitchen heard children's laughter. Sam looked up from his plate with syrup-sticky fingers. "Mr. Tom makes the best pancakes in the whole world, Mama. Even better than yours." "Sam," Emma said quickly, embarrassed by her son's brutal honesty. But Tom just chuckled. "High praise. Indeed. Though I suspect your mama's got talents in the kitchen I haven't even discovered yet." The casual warmth of his response put Emma at ease in a way she hadn't expected. Tom Harrison seemed genuinely pleased to have them there, without any of the barely concealed resentment she'd grown accustomed to from people who helped her out of obligation rather than choice. As they ate breakfast, Tom explained the realities of their situation with the practical calm of a man accustomed to dealing with transportation delays and weather emergencies. The trains wouldn't run for at least 3 days, possibly longer. depending on how quickly the crews could clear the mountain passes. Telegraph lines were down throughout the valley, making communication with the outside world impossible. For the immediate future, Willowbrook was effectively cut off from the rest of civilization. Folks here are used to being self-sufficient during storms like this, Tom explained, refilling Emma's coffee cup. Everyone looks out for their neighbors, shares what they have, and waits for nature to run its course. Nothing to do but hunker down and make the best of it. Emma nodded, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. 3 days would give her time to figure out her next move, but it would also mean 3 days of dependence on Tom's kindness. She'd learned the hard way that even the most generous gestures could come with strings attached, and she couldn't afford to let her guard down completely. The sound of heavy boots stomping on the front porch interrupted her worried thoughts. Tom opened the door to reveal Sheriff John Carter, a tall man with graying hair and the sort of steady presence that came from years of keeping peace in a frontier town. He stepped inside gratefully, shaking snow from his coat and hat. "Morning, Tom," the sheriff said, then nodded politely to Emma. "Ma'am, hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to check on everyone after yesterday's commotion at the station." Emma felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. News of her humiliating rejection had obviously spread through the small community, making her the subject of gossip and speculation. She braced herself for the sort of thinly veiled criticism she'd grown accustomed to receiving from authority figures. "Mrs. Clarke and her children are my guests, John," Tom said firmly. "They'll be staying here until the weather clears and the trains start running again." Sheriff Carter studied Emma with shrewd but not unkind eyes. "Heard about your trouble with Mitchell yesterday. Shame how some folks handle their business. Man gives his word. He ought to honor it regardless of circumstances." The sheriff's matter-of-fact defense surprised Emma. She'd expected judgment, or at least the sort of careful neutrality that officials used when dealing with potentially scandalous situations. Instead, Carter seemed to view Henry Mitchell as the one in the wrong. "Appreciate you saying so, Sheriff," Emma replied carefully. "Though I understand Mr. Mitchell's position, our arrangement wasn't what either of us expected." "Maybe not," Carter said, settling into the chair Tom offered him. "But leaving a lady and her children stranded in winter weather isn't what I'd call Christian behavior. Fortunately, Tom here has more sense than some folks." The conversation that followed revealed more about Willowbrook's social dynamics than Emma had gleaned from her brief time in town. Sheriff Carter spoke with easy familiarity about various residents, painting a picture of a community divided between those who measured worth by wealth and respectability, and those who valued character and decency above social standing. Victoria Ashford, who owned the town's only hotel, had already made her opinions about Emma's situation known to anyone willing to listen. In Victoria's view, women who answered mail-order bride advertisements were inherently suspect, and those who arrived with children and obvious pregnancies were absolutely beyond the pale. She'd made it clear that such people were not welcome in her establishment and shouldn't be encouraged to remain in Willowbrook by misguided charity. "Victoria's got strong opinions about maintaining proper standards," Carter explained diplomatically. "Course, her idea of proper standards doesn't always match up with what most folks would call Christian charity." Tom snorted. "Victoria Ashford's standards mostly involve making sure nobody she considers beneath her gets too comfortable in what she thinks of as her town." The sheriff's expression suggested he shared Tom's assessment, but was too diplomatic to say so directly. Instead, he turned the conversation to more practical matters, discussing which roads were passable and which families might need assistance during the extended storm. It was during this conversation that Emma first heard the name that would come to dominate her thoughts over the coming days. Charles Whitman, Victoria Ashford's son, had apparently been making rounds through town the previous evening, stirring up sentiment against the new arrivals and suggesting that allowing such people to remain would lower Willowbrook's reputation. among potential investors and respectable settlers. Charles has been drinking more than usual lately, Carter said with the careful tone of a lawman discussing someone who hadn't yet crossed legal lines but was clearly heading in that direction. Seems to think his mama's money gives him the right to decide who belongs here and who doesn't. Tom's jaw tightened. Charles Whitman's never done an honest day's work in his life, living off his mama's money and thinking that makes him better than folks who actually contribute something to this community. The sheriff nodded grimly. Problem is, Victoria's got enough influence with Mayor Blackwood that Charles's opinions carry more weight than they should. If he decides to make trouble for someone, the mayor tends to listen. Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. She was beginning to understand that her presence in Willowbrook was seen as more than just a temporary inconvenience by some residents. To people like Victoria Ashford and her son, Emma represented the sort of undesirable element that threatened their vision of what the town should become. After Sheriff Carter left, Tom seemed unusually quiet as he went about his daily routines. Emma helped him clear the breakfast dishes, grateful to have something useful to do while the children played with a set of wooden toys Tom had produced from somewhere in the cottage's depths. The domestic routine felt both natural and strange, like slipping into clothes that fit perfectly but belonged to someone else. "Tom," Emma said finally, unable to ignore the tension she sensed in him. "If my being here is going to cause you trouble with people like Mrs. Ashford, perhaps I should reconsider my options." Tom paused in his dishwashing, his hands still in the soapy water. "What kind of options are you thinking about?" Emma gestured vaguely toward the window, where snow continued to fall steadily. "When the weather clears, I could take the children and head further west. California, perhaps. Or Oregon. Somewhere we could start fresh without bringing complications into anyone else's life." "With what money?" Tom asked gently. "And in your condition?" "Emma, you're 7 months pregnant by my estimation. Traveling rough country with 2 small children and winter coming on isn't practical." The blunt assessment of her situation stung because it was accurate. Emma had perhaps enough money left for basic supplies for a week or two, certainly not enough for train tickets to California or the expenses of starting over in a new place. Her pregnancy limited her options for work, and the twins required constant supervision that would make any employment difficult. "Then what do you suggest?" she asked, frustration creeping into her voice. "I can't impose on your kindness indefinitely, and it's clear that some people in this town would prefer I disappear entirely." Tom dried his hands deliberately before turning to face her. "I suggest you stop worrying about what Victoria Ashford and her spoiled son think about anything. They don't speak for this town, no matter how much money they throw around." "But they have influence with the mayor," Emma pointed out. "Sheriff Carter made that clear." "Rick Blackwood's got his faults, but he's not stupid," Tom replied. "Push comes to shove, he knows which side his bread is buttered on. The railroad keeps this town alive, and I've got more influence with the railroad than Victoria's got with anybody who matters." Emma studied his face, seeing a quiet confidence that suggested Tom Harrison wielded more power in Willowbrook than his modest position might indicate. Station masters in railroad towns often held significant unofficial authority, controlling not just transportation but communication with the outside world and much of the commercial activity that kept small communities viable. "Besides," Tom continued, his expression softening, "you're not imposing on my kindness. You're giving me something I didn't realize I was missing." "What's that?" Emma asked softly. "Purpose," Tom said simply. "Something worth protecting. Someone to care about besides train schedules and freight manifests." The honesty in his voice caught Emma off guard. She'd grown so accustomed to being seen as a burden that the idea of being valued for her own sake seemed almost foreign. Tom Harrison looked at her as though she mattered, as though her presence enriched his life rather than complicating it. Before she could respond, Lucy came running over with tears streaming down her face. "Mama, Sam pulled my doll's hair, and now she looks funny." The moment of intimate conversation dissolved into the familiar chaos of mediating sibling disputes and repairing damaged toys. But as Emma comforted her daughter and gently corrected her son, she was aware of Tom watching them with an expression she couldn't quite identify. It wasn't pity or even simple kindness, but something deeper and more complex. That afternoon, while the children napped, Emma found herself helping Tom with paperwork in his small office behind the main room of the cottage. The storm had delayed several shipments and canceled multiple passenger trains, requiring extensive correspondence with railroad officials and careful rescheduling of freight deliveries. Emma's neat handwriting and quick comprehension of the documentation requirements made her a valuable assistant, and Tom seemed genuinely grateful for her help. "You've done this sort of work before," Tom observed, watching her efficiently organize a stack of shipping manifests. "My husband ran a small freight business before we bought the farm," Emma explained. "I handled most of the paperwork and correspondence. James was better with the actual transportation, but he said I had a head for details and organization." "He was right," Tom said, reviewing a letter she'd composed to the Denver freight office. "This is better written than most of the official correspondence I received from railroad headquarters." The compliment warmed Emma more than it probably should have. Her husband had valued her contributions to their business, but his death had left her feeling as though her skills and intelligence were somehow irrelevant to her survival. Tom's appreciation reminded her that she had abilities beyond childcare and domestic work, talents that could be valuable in the right circumstances. As the afternoon wore on, their conversation drifted from business matters to more personal topics. Tom spoke about his years as station master, the changes he'd witnessed in Willowbrook, and his quiet satisfaction in keeping the trains running smoothly through all manner of challenges. Emma found herself sharing memories of her life in Ohio, her marriage to James, and the gradual deterioration of their circumstances after his death. "Sounds like you had a good marriage," Tom said when she finished describing their small farm and the dreams they'd shared for expanding it. "We did," Emma replied, surprised by how little pain the admission caused her. "James was a good man. Kind, hard-working, devoted to the children and me. I loved him very much, but—" Tom prompted gently, seeming to sense something unspoken in her words. Emma was quiet for a long moment, considering how to articulate feelings she'd barely acknowledged to herself. "But our marriage was built on compatibility more than passion. We were partners, friends who loved each other and worked well together. It was comfortable and secure, but not particularly exciting." She paused, wondering why she was sharing such intimate thoughts with a man she'd known for barely 24 hours. "I suppose I always wondered what it would be like to feel that spark that people write about in novels. That sense of finding someone who completed you rather than simply complimented you." Tom was quiet, studying her face with an intensity that made her suddenly self-conscious. "And did you ever find that spark?" "No," Emma said softly. "Though I'm beginning to think it might not exist outside of fiction." "It exists," Tom said with quiet certainty. "Just rare enough that most people never experience it." Something in his voice made Emma look at him more closely, and what she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. Tom Harrison was looking at her as though she might be the answer to a question he'd been asking his entire life, and the intensity of that gaze sent warmth flooding through her that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the nearby stove. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Then Sam's voice called from the bedroom, breaking the spell and reminding them both of the practical realities that governed their current situation. That evening, as Emma tucked the children into the small bed Tom had arranged for them, Lucy asked the question that had been lurking in all their minds. "Mama, are we going to live here with Mr. Tom forever?" "I don't know, sweetheart," Emma answered honestly. Right now we're just staying until the storm passes and we can figure out what comes next. I hope we stay forever, Sam announced from his side of the bed. Mr. Tom knows lots of stories, and he said tomorrow he'll show us how the telegraph machine works. We'll see, Emma said, the phrase parents used when they wanted to avoid making promises they might not be able to keep. But as she returned to the main room and found Tom banking the fire for the night, Emma realized that her children weren't the only ones beginning to hope for something permanent. The cottage felt more like home after one day than anywhere she'd lived since James's death, and Tom Harrison made her feel valued and protected in ways she'd forgotten were possible. The storm outside showed no signs of abating, and Emma found herself grateful for the extended isolation that would give her time to explore these unexpected feelings. Whatever happened when the snow melted and the train started running again, she was beginning to suspect that leaving Willowbrook would be one of the hardest things she'd ever done. As she settled into her narrow bed that night, listening to the wind howl around the cottage and the gentle sounds of Tom moving about his evening routines, Emma allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to stay, to build a life in this small town with this quietly extraordinary man who treated her as though she were something precious rather than merely convenient. The thought should have terrified her, given how badly her last leap of faith had ended. Instead, it filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the quilts piled around her and everything to do with the growing certainty that sometimes the best destinations were the ones you never planned to reach. The storm finally broke on the fourth day, leaving Willowbrook buried under pristine snow that sparkled like diamonds in the morning sunlight. Emma stood at the kitchen window of Tom's cottage, watching the town emerge from its white cocoon as residents ventured out to check on neighbors and begin the arduous process of digging out from the blizzard. The children pressed their faces against the glass beside her, marveling at snowdrifts that reached nearly to the cottage's windows. Tom had been up since dawn, working with a crew of volunteers to clear the main streets and ensure the railroad tracks were passable for the freight train expected that afternoon. Emma could see him across the way, directing men with shovels and organizing the systematic removal of snow from critical areas. Even from a distance, his natural leadership was evident in the way other men deferred to his judgment and followed his instructions without question. Maggie O'Brien arrived just after noon, bustling through the cottage door with her arms full of covered dishes and her Irish accent thick with curiosity. The proprietor of Willowbrook's only proper diner was a woman of middle years whose warm heart was matched only by her irrepressible need to know everyone's business. She'd brought enough food to feed a small army, claiming it was her Christian duty to help folks who'd been stranded by the storm. "Sure, and you must be the famous Emma Clarke," Maggie said, setting her dishes on Tom's small table with efficient precision. "The whole town's been talking about you, though half of what they're saying is probably nonsense. I thought I'd come see for myself what sort of woman has managed to put such a spring in Tom Harrison's step." Emma felt her cheeks warm under Maggie's shrewd but friendly scrutiny. "I'm hardly famous, Mrs. O'Brien. Just someone who found herself in unfortunate circumstances. Circumstances have a way of working out for the best when the right people get involved," Maggie replied with a meaningful glance toward the window where Tom could be seen organizing snow removal efforts. "That man's been alone too long, and it shows. Been waiting for someone worth opening his heart to." Lucy and Sam emerged from their bedroom, drawn by the smell of Maggie's cooking and the sound of a new voice. The Irish woman immediately swept them into her orbit, exclaiming over their good manners and bright eyes while pressing cookies into their eager hands. Within minutes, she had them seated at the table and was regaling them with stories about her own grandchildren back in Boston. "Tom tells me you've been helping with the railroad paperwork," Maggie said to Emma as she served generous portions of beef stew and fresh bread. "Man's been struggling to keep up with all that correspondence since his assistant took sick last month. Lucky for him you turned up when you did." Emma hadn't realized Tom had been without clerical help, which explained his obvious relief at her assistance with the mountain of documentation that had accumulated during the storm. The work came naturally to her, and she'd found genuine satisfaction in bringing order to the chaos of freight schedules and passenger manifests. "I enjoy the work," Emma admitted. "It feels good to be useful again." "Useful," Maggie repeated, with a snort. "Child, you've got skills that half the men in this territory would pay good money for. Organization, correspondence, bookkeeping, and Tom says you've got a head for figures that would make a banker jealous. That's not just useful. That's valuable." The compliment surprised Emma, who had grown accustomed to thinking of herself primarily as a burden. Her husband had appreciated her business skills, but his death had made her feel as though such abilities were luxuries she could no longer afford. Survival had become about finding someone willing to support her and the children, not about contributing her own talents to a partnership. "Course, some folks in town have different ideas about what makes a woman valuable," Maggie continued, her tone sharpening. "Victoria Ashford's been holding court at the hotel, explaining to anyone who'll listen why certain types of women shouldn't be encouraged to settle in respectable communities." Emma's stomach tightened. She'd been dreading this moment when the protective isolation of the storm would end and she'd have to face the judgment of Willowbrook's more prominent citizens. Victoria Ashford's disapproval was particularly troubling because of her apparent influence with local officials. "What exactly has Mrs. Ashford been saying?" Emma asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Maggie's expression grew grim. Nothing she'd repeat in front of Pastor Campbell, I'll tell you that much. Lots of talk about maintaining standards and protecting the town's reputation. Her boy Charles has been even worse, making all sorts of suggestions about what kind of woman answers mail-order bride advertisements. The implications were clear and deeply humiliating. Emma had feared this sort of speculation, but hearing it confirmed still felt like a physical blow. In Victoria Ashford's version of events, Emma was undoubtedly a woman of questionable morals who had deliberately deceived Henry Mitchell and was now taking advantage of Tom Harrison's misplaced charity. "Don't you pay them any mind," Maggie said firmly, reaching across the table to squeeze Emma's hand. "Victoria Ashford came here 20 years ago with money from her late husband's mining investments and set herself up as Queen Bee. She's forgotten what it's like to struggle or need help from anyone. As for Charles, that boy's never done anything harder than lifting a whiskey glass." Sam looked up from his cookie with the innocent directness of a child. "Why is the lady mean to Mama? Mama's nice to everyone." Maggie's expression softened as she looked at the little boy. "Some people are mean because they're scared, sweetheart. They think if they're not mean to folks who are different, then maybe they won't be special anymore." It was a surprisingly astute explanation of the psychology behind Victoria Ashford's behavior, and Emma found herself impressed by Maggie's wisdom. The Irish woman had clearly spent years observing human nature from her position at the center of Willowbrook's social life. Tom returned to the cottage just as Maggie was preparing to leave, stamping snow from his boots and bringing the smell of cold air and honest work into the warm kitchen. His face lit up at the sight of Maggie's feast spread across his table, and he greeted the older woman with genuine affection. "Maggie O'Brien, you're an angel of mercy," he said, pulling off his heavy coat. "We've been living on my cooking for 4 days, and I'm sure Emma and the children are ready for something that won't break their teeth." "Your cooking's not that bad," Emma protested, though she had to admit Maggie's stew was considerably more flavorful than Tom's utilitarian approach to meal preparation. "It's terrible and you know it," Tom replied with a grin. "I can manage coffee and basic sustenance, but anything requiring actual skill is beyond me." Maggie watched this exchange with obvious satisfaction, as if confirming suspicions she'd harbored about the developing relationship between Tom and Emma. "Well then, it's lucky you've found yourself a woman who knows her way around a kitchen. Emma here's been telling me about her other talents too." Tom settled into his chair with A sigh of satisfaction, accepting the bowl Emma handed him with a grateful smile. She's been invaluable with the paperwork. Cut through 3 days' worth of correspondence in a few hours and organized everything so efficiently I can actually find what I need. Told you, Maggie said to Emma with a triumphant expression. Valuable, not just useful. As they ate, Tom filled them in on the day's activities and the town's gradual return to normal life. The railroad crews had worked through the morning to clear the tracks, and the first train since the storm was expected within hours. Mail would be delivered, delayed freight would finally reach its destinations, and stranded passengers would be able to continue their journeys. Emma felt a stab of anxiety at this news. The return of train service meant she would have to make decisions about her future, choices that had been safely postponed during the storm's isolation. She could continue west, using her remaining money for tickets to California or Oregon. She could return east, though the prospect of going back to Ohio with nothing to show for her journey felt like admitting defeat. Or she could explore the possibility of staying in Willowbrook, assuming the town's more influential residents would tolerate her presence. Speaking of the railroad, Maggie said, glancing meaningfully at Tom, I heard Mayor Blackwood's been asking questions about your temporary assistant. Seems Victoria's convinced him that irregular arrangements might reflect poorly on the town's business reputation. Tom's jaw tightened, and Emma saw a flash of anger in his usually calm demeanor. Rick Blackwood needs to remember who keeps the railroad happy and the freight moving through this town. Without regular service, Willowbrook dies, and everyone knows it. Oh, I agree completely, Maggie said. Just thought you should know which way the wind's blowing from the mayor's office. After Maggie left, Tom was unusually quiet as he helped Emma clean up from lunch. The children had settled in front of the fire with their toys, leaving the adults to deal with the adult concerns that had been temporarily suspended during the storm. Tom, Emma said finally, unable to bear the tension any longer. If my staying here is going to cause you problems with the town officials, perhaps it would be better if I made other arrangements. Tom stopped drying dishes and turned to face her fully. What kind of other arrangements? I could take the evening train west, Emma said, though the words felt like swallowing glass. Find work in Denver or continue on to California. The children and I have imposed on your kindness long enough. Imposed, Tom repeated, his voice flat. Is that how you see this? As an imposition? Emma struggled to find the right words. The past 4 days had been the most peaceful she'd experienced since James's death, and leaving Tom's cottage felt like abandoning the first real home she'd found since losing the farm. But she'd also learned to be practical about her circumstances, and realistic about what she could expect from others. I see it as a temporary arrangement that's becoming complicated by factors neither of us anticipated, she said carefully. You've been extraordinarily kind, but I won't be responsible for damaging your reputation or your position in this community. Tom set down the dish towel and moved closer, his expression intense. Emma, I need you to understand something. Having you here isn't an act of charity or temporary kindness. These past 4 days have been the happiest I've had in 15 years. The admission hung between them, heavy with implications neither had been ready to face. Emma felt her heart racing as she looked into Tom's eyes and saw an emotion that went far beyond mere attraction or companionship. You don't know me well enough to make that kind of statement, she said softly. We've been thrown together by circumstances, sharing close quarters during a crisis. That's not the same as building a real relationship, isn't it? Tom asked, moving close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Emma, I've been watching people for 35 years, and I've never met anyone who fit into my life the way you do. The way you organize my paperwork, the way you make this cottage feel like a home, the way you handle the children with such patience and love. The way you make me want to be a better man than I thought I was capable of being. Emma felt tears threatening as she recognized the sincerity in his voice. Tom Harrison was offering her something she'd never thought to hope for again. Not just security or companionship, but genuine love and partnership with a man who valued her for who she was rather than what she could provide. "Tom," she began. But he held up a hand to stop her. "I know this is moving fast," he said. "I know you've been hurt, and you're worried about your children's future. I know you have every reason to be cautious about trusting another man after what Mitchell put you through. But I also know that what's happening between us is real and rare and worth fighting for." Before Emma could respond, a sharp knock at the front door interrupted their conversation. Tom answered it to find Pastor William Campbell standing on the porch, his expression serious despite his usual gentle demeanor. "Afternoon, Tom," the pastor said, stepping inside gratefully. "Mrs. Clarke, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all, Pastor," Emma replied, though her heart was still racing from Tom's declaration. "Would you like some coffee?" "That would be lovely, thank you." Pastor Campbell settled into the offered chair, his weathered face showing the strain of recent conversations. "I'm afraid I have some concerning news. There's been talk around town about your situation, Mrs. Clarke, and I felt you should hear it directly rather than through gossip." Emma's stomach clenched as she poured coffee for their unexpected visitor. She'd been dreading this moment, when Willowbrook's moral arbiters would arrive to pass judgment on her character and circumstances. "What sort of talk?" Tom asked, his voice carefully controlled. Pastor Campbell sighed heavily. "Victoria Ashford has been quite vocal about her concerns regarding the propriety of your current living arrangements. She's convinced Mayor Blackwood that having an unmarried woman living with an unmarried man, particularly one with children and obvious pregnancy, reflects poorly on the town's moral standards." "And what do you think, Pastor?" Emma asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. The older man studied her with kind but serious eyes. "I think you're a woman in difficult circumstances who's been offered shelter by a good Christian man. I also think that appearances matter in a small community, regardless of the reality behind them." Tom's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "So what are you suggesting, Will? That I turn Emma and her children out into the cold because Victoria Ashford's got her nose out of joint?" "I'm suggesting," Pastor Campbell said gently, "that we find a solution that protects everyone involved while honoring both Christian charity and community standards." Emma felt a familiar sinking sensation as she realized where this conversation was heading. Once again, her presence was becoming a problem that required solving, a complication that threatened the peace of others. No matter how kind Tom had been or how welcome he'd made her feel, the reality was that her reputation and circumstances made her a liability in a respectable community. "What kind of solution?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Pastor." Campbell hesitated, clearly struggling with the delicate nature of the situation. "Well, there are several possibilities. You could find other accommodations in town, though I understand that presents financial difficulties. You could continue your journey west once the trains are running regularly. Or—" He paused, glancing between Tom and Emma with an expression that suggested he was about to propose something that would change all their lives forever. "Or you could consider making your arrangement permanent and respectable through marriage," he finished quietly. "I've performed such ceremonies before, for couples whose circumstances required quick solutions to immediate problems. It's not uncommon on the frontier." The suggestion hit Emma like a physical blow. Marriage to Tom Harrison would solve her immediate problems and provide security for her children, but it would also bind her to a man she'd known for less than a week. Despite her growing feelings for him, the idea of entering another marriage of convenience felt like admitting that love was a luxury she couldn't afford. Tom's reaction was immediate and decisive. "Emma," he said, turning to face her with an expression of determined hope, "will you marry me?" The proposal hung in the air between them, simple and direct and utterly life-changing. Emma looked into Tom's eyes and saw not pity or obligation, but genuine love and commitment. He wasn't offering marriage as a solution to a problem, but as the natural expression of feelings that had been growing between them since that first morning on the train platform. Lucy looked up from her toys with bright curiosity. "Mama, what's marriage?" "It's when two people who love each other promise to take care of each other forever," Emma replied automatically, her eyes never leaving Tom's face. "Like you and Daddy did?" Sam asked with the directness of childhood. "Yes, sweetheart," Emma said softly. "Like Daddy and I did." But even as she spoke, Emma knew that what Tom was offering was different from what she'd shared with James. This wasn't compatibility and partnership, but the kind of deep connection she'd wondered about in novels. Tom Harrison looked at her as though she were the answer to every prayer he'd never dared to voice, and the intensity of that devotion both thrilled and terrified her. "I need time to think," she said finally, though her heart was already racing toward an answer that both excited and frightened her. "Of course," Tom replied, though the disappointment in his voice was evident. "This is a big decision. Take all the time you need." Pastor Campbell rose to leave, but paused at the door with a final piece of advice. "Mrs. Clarke, I've known Tom Harrison for 15 years. He's one of the finest men I've ever met, and he'd move heaven and earth to make you happy. But more importantly, he'd respect your choice either way." After the pastor left, Emma sat in front of the fire with the children, trying to process the events of the afternoon. Tom busied himself with evening chores, giving her space to think while remaining close enough to provide comfort if she needed it. As darkness fell over Willowbrook, Emma realized that the storm that had brought her to Tom's cottage had been nothing compared to the emotional tempest now raging in her heart. She was falling in love with a man who offered her everything she'd ever wanted, but accepting his proposal would mean trusting her heart to someone new when she was still healing from loss. The sound of a train whistle in the distance reminded her that the outside world was returning to Willowbrook, bringing with it all the complications and choices she'd been able to avoid during the storm's protective isolation. Tomorrow she would have to give Tom an answer that would determine not just her own future, but the lives of her children and the man who'd opened his heart to them all. Emma woke before dawn to the sound of raised voices outside the cottage. Through the frost-covered window, she could see Mayor Richard Blackwood standing in the snow with two other men, their breath creating clouds in the bitter morning air as they gestured toward Tom's home. Her heart sank as she recognized the unmistakable posture of officials conducting business they considered unpleasant, but necessary. Tom was already awake, pulling on his boots with grim efficiency. He'd heard the voices too, and his expression suggested he knew exactly what kind of conversation awaited him outside. Emma quickly dressed and checked on the children, who were still sleeping peacefully, blissfully unaware that their fragile new world was about to be tested. "Stay inside with Lucy and Sam," Tom said quietly, reaching for his heavy coat. "Whatever happens out there, don't let them see you're worried." Emma nodded, though her stomach was churning with anxiety. Through the window she watched Tom emerge from the cottage and approach the three men with the calm dignity she'd come to associate with his character. Mayor Blackwood was doing most of the talking, while the other two men flanked him like deputies preparing for trouble. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, with voices occasionally rising loud enough for Emma to catch fragments of words through the glass. She heard reputation and standards and community values, spoken with the sort of righteous indignation that suggested people who'd never faced real hardship passing judgment on those who had. Tom's responses were too quiet to discern, but his posture remained straight and unyielding throughout the confrontation. When the men finally left, Tom stood alone in the snow for several minutes before returning to the cottage. His face was carefully composed, but Emma could see the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. "What did they want?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. Tom poured himself coffee with hands that trembled slightly, whether from cold or fury, Emma couldn't tell. Victoria Ashford's convinced the mayor that your presence here is damaging the town's reputation. Seems she's been writing letters to territorial officials and potential investors, warning them about Willowbrook's declining moral standards. Emma felt sick. She'd known this moment would come, but the reality of being branded a threat to community decency still hit her like a physical blow. What exactly is she telling them? Nothing she can prove, but plenty she can imply, Tom replied grimly. Unmarried woman living with unmarried man, mysterious pregnancy, children of questionable parentage. She's painting a picture that makes Willowbrook sound like some sort of frontier den of iniquity. The unfairness of it burned in Emma's chest. Victoria Ashford was attacking her character without knowing anything about her circumstances or the choices that had led her to this point. To someone sitting comfortably in a mansion bought with inherited wealth, Emma's struggles probably seemed like evidence of moral failing rather than simple human misfortune. And the mayor believes her accusations? Tom's laugh was bitter. Rick Blackwood believes whatever benefits Rick Blackwood. Victoria's money talks loud in this town, and she's threatened to pull her investments if the situation isn't resolved to her satisfaction. Emma sank into a chair, the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Once again, her presence was causing problems for good people who didn't deserve to suffer for her sake. Tom had shown her nothing but kindness, and now his position in the community was being threatened because of her. I should leave on today's train, she said quietly, before this gets any worse for you. No. Tom's voice was sharp enough to make her look up in surprise. Emma, you're not running away because Victoria Ashford's got her corset strings too tight. We're going to face this head-on. Before Emma could respond, Lucy and Sam emerged from the bedroom, rubbing sleepy eyes and immediately sensing the tension in the room. Children had an uncanny ability to detect adult anxiety, and both twins moved closer to their mother with the instinctive wariness of young creatures sensing danger. Are the angry people coming back? Sam asked with the directness that never failed to surprise adults. What angry people, sweetheart? Emma asked, though she knew her son had probably overheard more of the morning's confrontation than she'd realized. The ones outside talking loud, Lucy explained. They sounded like Mr. Mitchell at the train station. Emma exchanged a glance with Tom, both of them recognizing that the children were already beginning to associate raised voices with threat and rejection. The last thing she wanted was for Lucy and Sam to grow up feeling unwelcome wherever they went. Tom knelt down to the children's level, his voice gentle despite the fury still evident in his eyes. Sometimes grown-ups disagree about things, and they forget to use their indoor voices. But nobody's going to hurt you or your mama, I promise. Are we going to stay here with you forever? Lucy asked with the innocent hope that made Emma's heart ache. That's up to your mama, Tom replied, glancing at Emma with an expression that held both love and challenge. But I hope so. After breakfast, Tom left for the railroad station to handle the increased traffic that always followed major storms. Emma spent the morning doing laundry and trying to keep the children occupied while her mind raced through possible solutions to their dilemma. None of the options seemed particularly appealing, and all of them involved sacrificing something precious that she'd only just begun to hope for. Around midday, Dr. Rebecca Stone arrived at the cottage, carrying her medical bag and wearing the sort of determined expression that suggested someone on a mission. Emma had met the doctor briefly at Maggie's diner, but this was the first time Rebecca had visited the cottage. Mrs. Clarke, Dr. Stone said without preamble, I need to speak with you about your pregnancy and your general health. May I come in? Emma stepped aside to admit the doctor, wondering if this visit was related to the morning's confrontation with Mayor Blackwood. Rebecca Stone was one of the few professional women in Willowbrook, and her position gave her a unique perspective on the town's social dynamics. "Are you here in a medical capacity or a social one?" Emma asked as she offered the doctor coffee. "Both," Rebecca replied honestly. "I'm concerned about your health, particularly given the stress you've been under lately. But I'm also concerned about the campaign being waged against you by certain members of this community." Emma settled into a chair across from the doctor, grateful for what seemed like a friendly voice in an increasingly hostile environment. "I take it you've heard about Mrs. Ashford's objections to my presence here." Victoria Ashford's objections to everything that doesn't conform to her narrow view of propriety, Rebecca said with obvious distaste. The woman seems to forget that she wasn't born to wealth and respectability. Her late husband made his money in some very questionable mining deals, and her own arrival in Willowbrook 20 years ago caused quite a scandal. This was news to Emma, who had assumed Victoria's hostility stemmed from a lifetime of privilege and social superiority. "What kind of scandal?" Rebecca glanced toward the bedroom where the children were playing, then lowered her voice. Victoria arrived in Willowbrook as the very young widow of a much older man, with enough money to buy the biggest house in town and no family connections to vouch for her character. There were plenty of whispers about how exactly she'd acquired her wealth, and whether her marriage had been as respectable as she claimed. The irony wasn't lost on Emma that Victoria Ashford, who had apparently overcome her own questionable past to become the town's moral arbiter, was now trying to deny the same opportunity for redemption to someone else. "Why are you telling me this?" Emma asked. "Because I want you to understand that Victoria's hostility isn't really about protecting community standards," Rebecca replied. "It's about protecting her own position. She's afraid that if the town accepts you despite your circumstances, people might start questioning how she earned her own acceptance." Rebecca conducted a thorough examination of Emma's health, pronouncing both mother and unborn child to be in excellent condition despite recent stresses. As she packed up her medical instruments, the doctor's expression grew serious. "Emma, I'm going to be blunt with you about something. Tom Harrison's proposal wasn't just an attempt to solve your immediate problems. That man has been in love with you since the moment he saw you step off the train." Emma felt her cheeks warm. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I've been treating Tom's various minor ailments for years, and I've never seen him look the way he does when he talks about you. He's not offering marriage out of pity or obligation. He's offering it because he's found the woman he wants to spend the rest of his life with." The doctor's words echoed Emma's own growing suspicions about Tom's feelings, but hearing them, confirmed by an outside observer, made them seem more real and significant. Tom Harrison wasn't just being kind to a woman in distress. He was genuinely in love with her. "But we've only known each other for a few days," Emma protested. "How long did you know your first husband before you married him?" Rebecca asked. Emma considered the question. "We courted for 8 months, but our families had known each other for years. It was a very gradual process. And how did that work out for you?" "It was a good marriage," Emma said honestly. "Comfortable, stable, built on mutual respect and shared goals. But not passionate," Rebecca observed with the insight of someone who'd spent years listening to patients share their deepest concerns. Emma's silence was answer enough. "Emma," Rebecca continued gently, "there's nothing wrong with marrying for practical reasons, especially when you have children to consider. But there's also nothing wrong with marrying for love, even if that love developed quickly under unusual circumstances." After Dr. Stone left, Emma spent the afternoon wrestling with decisions that seemed to grow more complicated by the hour. The practical arguments for accepting Tom's proposal were overwhelming. Marriage would provide security for her children, resolve the community's concerns about propriety, and give her a role and purpose in Willowbrook that went beyond being an object of charity. But the emotional arguments were equally compelling. She was falling in love with Tom Harrison in a way that she'd never experienced before, with an intensity that both thrilled and terrified her. The thought of binding herself to him through Marriage felt like stepping off a cliff, trusting that he would catch her and hold her safe. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Charles Whitman, Victoria Ashford's son, who appeared at the cottage door just as Emma was preparing to start dinner. Charles was a man in his late 20s with the soft appearance of someone who'd never done manual labor, and his expensive clothes marked him as a person of means and leisure. "Mrs. Clarke," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I wanted to speak with you about your situation here in Willowbrook." Emma reluctantly invited him inside, though every instinct warned her that Charles Whitman's visit was unlikely to be friendly. He carried himself with the arrogant confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through money and influence rather than merit or charm. "I understand you've been having some difficulties with certain members of our community," Charles sighed, settling into Tom's favorite chair with presumptuous familiarity. "My mother and I are concerned about the awkward position this puts everyone in." "What exactly is your concern, Mr. Whitman?" Emma asked, remaining standing to maintain whatever advantage she could in the conversation. Charles's smile became more predatory. "Well, it's quite simple, really. You're obviously a woman of some intelligence and capability, despite your current circumstances. It seems a shame to waste those qualities in a situation that can only end badly for everyone involved." Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. "I'm not sure what you're suggesting." "I'm suggesting a solution that benefits everyone," Charles replied smoothly. "My mother and I have discussed your situation extensively, and we're prepared to offer you a generous sum to relocate somewhere more suitable to your needs. Denver, perhaps, or California. Somewhere you could start fresh without the complications that seem to follow you here." The offer hit Emma like a slap. Charles Whitman was essentially trying to pay her to leave town, as if she were some sort of undesirable influence that could be bought off and sent away. The condescension in his voice made it clear that he viewed her as little more than a problem to be solved with money. "And if I refuse your generous offer?" Emma asked, her voice carefully controlled. Charles's expression hardened. "Then I'm afraid things could become quite unpleasant for everyone involved. My mother has considerable influence with territorial officials, and Tom Harrison's position with the railroad depends on maintaining good relationships with local authorities. It would be unfortunate if his employment were to suffer because of misguided charity." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Charles was essentially blackmailing her, threatening Tom's livelihood if she didn't accept their bribe to leave town. Emma felt rage building in her chest at the casual cruelty of people who used their wealth and position to destroy others. "Mr. Whitman," she said with icy politeness, "I think you should leave now before you say something we'll both regret." "I hope you'll consider our offer carefully," Charles replied, rising from his chair with theatrical reluctance. "It really would be the best solution for everyone, especially those poor children of yours. Wouldn't want them to suffer because of their mother's poor judgment." The reference to Lucy and Sam pushed Emma past the breaking point. "Get out," she said sharply. "Get out of this house right now and don't come back." Charles's mask of civility finally slipped, revealing the ugly arrogance beneath. "You're making a mistake, Mrs. Clarke. My family doesn't make idle threats, and we don't forget people who cross us. Tom Harrison will regret the day he ever laid eyes on you." After Charles left, Emma sank into a chair with shaking hands. The confrontation had made several things crystal clear. Victoria Ashford wasn't content to simply ostracize Emma. She was prepared to destroy Tom's career to force her compliance. The stakes had escalated beyond social disapproval to economic warfare, and Emma was the weapon being used against a man who'd done nothing but show her kindness. When Tom returned that evening, he found Emma pacing the cottage like a caged animal, her face tight with suppressed fury. The children were unusually quiet, sensing their mother's agitation, even though they didn't understand its source. "Charles," Whitman was here, Emma said without preamble. He offered me money to leave town and threatened your job if I refuse. Tom's face went completely still, the kind of dangerous calm that preceded violence. What exactly did he say? Emma recounted the entire conversation, watching Tom's expression grow darker with each detail. By the time she finished, his hands were clenched into fists and his jaw was tight enough to crack teeth. They're not going to intimidate you into leaving, Tom said with quiet intensity. I don't care what threats they make or what influence they think they have. You belong here, Emma, with me. But your job, Emma began. Will survive whatever Victoria Ashford throws at it, Tom interrupted. The railroad doesn't care about local social politics, as long as the trains run on time and the freight gets through. My record speaks for itself. Emma wanted to believe him, but she'd seen what people like Victoria Ashford could accomplish when they set their minds to destroying someone. Money and influence had a way of making problems disappear, even when those problems were good people who didn't deserve to be hurt. Tom, she said softly, maybe it would be better if I did leave. I could take the children to California, find work there, start over somewhere the Ashfords can't reach us. Tom crossed the room in 3 strides and took her hands in his eyes blazing with determination. Emma, listen to me. I've spent 15 years of my life waiting for someone like you to walk into it. I'm not going to let Victoria Ashford's jealousy and her son's threats drive you away. But the children, Emma protested, will be safer and happier here with people who love them than they'll ever be running from one place to another, Tom said firmly. Lucy and Sam deserve a home, a real home with 2 parents who can protect them and give them stability. Emma looked into Tom's eyes and saw not just love, but absolute commitment to her and the children's welfare. He wasn't offering marriage as a convenient solution to a temporary problem. He was offering to build a life together that could withstand whatever challenges the future might bring. Emma, Tom said softly, I'm asking you again, will you marry me? Not because you have to, not because it's the practical thing to do, but because I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that you and the children are the most precious things in my world. Emma felt tears streaming down her face as she realized that her choice had already been made. Despite all her fears and all the practical arguments against trusting her heart to another person, she knew that Tom Harrison was offering her something worth fighting for. Yes, she whispered, and then louder, yes, Tom, I'll marry you. The joy that transformed Tom's face was like watching the sunrise after the longest night. He swept her into his arms, spinning her around the small cottage while the children laughed and demanded to know what had made the grown-ups so happy. But even as Emma celebrated her decision, she knew that the real battle was just beginning. Victoria Ashford and her son weren't going to accept defeat gracefully, and the next few days would test every aspect of her new relationship with Tom. They would have to prove not just to the community, but to themselves that love could triumph over prejudice, that courage could overcome intimidation, and that sometimes the most unconventional families were also the strongest. The morning of Emma and Tom's wedding dawned crisp and clear, with sunlight streaming through the windows of Pastor Campbell's modest church and reflecting off the fresh snow that blanketed Willowbrook. Emma stood before the small mirror in the church's back room, adjusting the simple blue dress that Maggie O'Brien had helped her alter for the occasion. It wasn't the elaborate gown she'd worn for her first wedding, but it felt more precious somehow, chosen with love rather than family expectation. Lucy and Sam pressed close to their mother, unusually solemn in their best clothes, as they tried to understand the significance of the day. Dr. Rebecca Stone had volunteered to serve as matron of honor, while Sheriff Carter would stand with Tom as his best man. The guest list was intentionally small, limited to those who had shown genuine support for the couple, despite the controversy surrounding their union. "Mama, you look like a princess," Lucy whispered, touching the delicate lace collar that had belonged to Emma's grandmother. "Thank you, sweetheart," Emma replied, though her hands trembled slightly as she fastened her mother's pearl earrings. The jewelry represented her last tangible connection to her previous life, and wearing it today felt like carrying her family's blessing into this new chapter. Maggie bustled into the room, carrying a bouquet of winter roses she'd somehow managed to procure despite the season. "Now don't you worry about a thing," she said, pressing the flowers into Emma's hands. "Tom's been pacing the front of the church like a man who's found treasure and can't quite believe it's real." Through the small window, Emma could see carriages arriving as invited guests made their way through the snow to the church entrance. But she also noticed a group of well-dressed figures gathering across the street, watching the proceedings with obvious disapproval. Victoria Ashford stood among them, her black coat and severe expression making her look like a crow among peacocks. "They're here," Emma said quietly, her stomach tightening with familiar anxiety. "Let them watch," Maggie replied firmly. "Some people got nothing better to do than stand in the cold, judging other folks' happiness. Don't let their sour faces spoil your joy." Pastor Campbell appeared in the doorway, his kind face glowing with genuine pleasure. "Mrs. Clarke, we're ready when you are. And might I say, you make a beautiful bride." Emma took a deep breath, gathering her courage for what lay ahead. The ceremony itself would be simple, but she knew that the real challenges would come afterward, when she and Tom would have to prove to themselves and the community that their love could withstand whatever obstacles others might place in their path. The church was small but warmly decorated with candles and evergreen boughs that filled the air with the scent of winter forest. As Emma walked down the aisle with Lucy and Sam beside her, she saw Tom waiting at the altar with an expression of such pure joy that it took her breath away. He wore his best suit, his hair neatly combed and his face clean-shaven, but it was the love shining in his eyes that transformed him into the most handsome man she'd ever seen. The ceremony began with Pastor Campbell's gentle words about the sacred nature of marriage and the courage required to build a life together in an uncertain world. Emma found herself listening more carefully than she had at her first wedding, understanding now what it truly meant to promise your heart to another person. "Thomas Harrison," Pastor Campbell said, "do you take Emma Clarke to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Tom replied, his voice strong and clear, carrying easily through the small church. "With all my heart I do." "Emma Clarke, do you take Thomas Harrison to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for as long as you both shall live?" Emma looked into Tom's eyes and saw not just her future, but her home. "I do," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I do, with all my heart." As Tom slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, Emma felt a sense of completeness she'd never experienced before. This wasn't just a marriage of convenience or practical necessity, but the joining of two souls who had found in each other everything they'd been seeking without knowing it. "You may kiss your bride," Pastor Campbell announced with obvious satisfaction. Tom's kiss was gentle but passionate, full of promise and commitment that spoke of years of happiness ahead. The small congregation erupted in applause and cheers, with Lucy and Sam clapping enthusiastically, despite not entirely understanding what they were celebrating. But the sound of celebration was interrupted by a commotion outside. Through the church windows, Emma could see the group of disapproving onlookers had grown larger, and their murmurs of displeasure were becoming audible even through the thick walls. Victoria Ashford seemed to be holding court, gesturing dramatically toward the church while her followers nodded in agreement. "Ignore them," Tom whispered in Emma's ear as they signed the marriage certificate. "This is our day, our moment. Nothing they say or do can change what just happened here." Emma nodded, trying to hold on to the joy of the ceremony even as anxiety crept back into her thoughts. She'd hoped that marriage might end the controversy surrounding her presence in Willowbrook, but it was becoming clear that Victoria Ashford's campaign against her was far from over. The wedding party emerged from the church into brilliant sunshine and biting cold, with well-wishers throwing rice and offering congratulations. Maggie had prepared a small reception at her diner, and the group began making their way through the snow toward the warmth and food that awaited them. It was then that Mayor Blackwood appeared, flanked by two men Emma didn't recognize. Their official bearing and serious expressions suggested this wasn't a social visit, and Emma felt Tom tense beside her as they approached. "Tom, Mrs. Harrison," the mayor said with forced politeness, "I'm sorry to interrupt your celebration, but we have some urgent business to discuss." "What kind of business?" Tom asked, his voice carefully controlled. "The kind that can't wait," one of the strangers replied. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the pale complexion of someone who spent his time indoors with paperwork. "I'm Regional Supervisor Morrison from the Denver Railroad office. We've received some concerning reports about irregularities in station operations here in Willowbrook." Emma's heart sank as she realized what was happening. Victoria Ashford had made good on her threat to involve railroad officials, timing the confrontation for maximum emotional impact on Emma and Tom's wedding day. The cruelty of it took her breath away. "What kind of irregularities?" Sheriff Carter asked, stepping closer to the group with his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Supervisor Morrison consulted a sheaf of papers with bureaucratic precision. Reports of unauthorized personnel handling confidential railroad documents, improper use of company facilities for personal purposes, and failure to maintain appropriate professional standards in station operations. Tom's face had gone completely still, the dangerous calm that Emma had learned to recognize. "Those are serious accusations, Mr. Morrison. I assume you have evidence to support them?" "We have sworn statements from concerned citizens regarding your recent conduct," Morrison replied. "Mrs. Victoria Ashford has provided detailed documentation of what she considers violations of railroad policy and community standards." Emma felt sick as she realized the full scope of Victoria's revenge. By involving railroad officials and framing Tom's kindness as professional misconduct, Victoria was attempting to destroy his career and reputation in one coordinated attack. "What exactly is Mrs. Ashford claiming?" Dr. Stone asked, her medical training making her naturally suspicious of vague accusations without specific evidence. Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "She alleges that Mr. Harrison has been allowing unauthorized individuals to access confidential railroad correspondence, has been using company property for personal lodging arrangements, and has generally conducted himself in a manner unbefitting a railroad employee." "That's ridiculous," Maggie burst out. "Tom Harrison's the best station master this town's ever had. The trains run on time, the freight moves efficiently, and passengers are treated with respect and courtesy. What more could the railroad want?" "We're not questioning Mr. Harrison's technical competence," Morrison replied carefully. "But the railroad has a reputation to maintain, and reports of irregular personal conduct reflect poorly on the company's image." Emma stepped forward, her anger overriding her anxiety. "Mr. Morrison, exactly what irregular conduct are you referring to?" "My husband provided shelter to a stranded passenger and her children during a blizzard. If showing Christian charity in emergency circumstances violates railroad policy, perhaps the company needs to reconsider its values." Morrison's expression suggested he was beginning to understand that he'd walked into a more complex situation than Victoria Ashford had described. "Mrs. Harrison, I'm simply investigating reports that have been brought to the company's attention. No final decisions have been made." "But decisions are being considered," Tom said grimly. "What exactly is the railroad proposing to do about these alleged violations?" "That depends on our investigation and Mr. Harrison's response to the allegations," Morrison replied. "The company is prepared to consider various options, including reassignment to another location, suspension pending further review, or termination if warranted by the evidence. Emma felt the bottom drop out of her world. After everything they'd overcome, after finding love and building the foundation for a family, Victoria Ashford was going to destroy it all with lies and bureaucratic manipulation. The timing was deliberately cruel, designed to turn their wedding day into a disaster that would haunt them forever. But Tom wasn't finished fighting. "Mr. Morrison, I'd like to see those sworn statements you mentioned." Under railroad employee protection regulations, I have the right to face my accusers and examine any evidence being used against me. Morrison looked uncomfortable for the first time. "Well, the statements are confidential personnel matters." "No, they're not," Sheriff Carter interrupted. "If you're conducting an official investigation based on public allegations, then the accused has the right to see the evidence. That's basic legal procedure, regardless of railroad policies. Furthermore," Tom continued, his voice growing stronger, "I'd like to request a formal hearing with railroad officials, including representatives from the territorial government who can verify the accuracy of these allegations. If Mrs. Ashford wants to question my character and competence, she can do it in front of witnesses who can evaluate her credibility." Emma watched with growing admiration as Tom took control of the situation. Instead of being defensive or intimidated, he was forcing the railroad to follow proper procedures and hold Victoria Ashford accountable for her accusations. The quiet competence that made him such an effective station master was now being turned toward protecting his family and career. Morrison was clearly beginning to regret his involvement in what was obviously a personal vendetta disguised as professional concern. "Mr. Harrison, perhaps we could discuss this matter privately without involving my wife?" Tom asked sharply. "Mr. Morrison, these allegations are clearly related to my marriage and family situation. Any investigation or hearing will include my wife, and any decisions made will affect both of us. She has every right to be present for these discussions." Pastor Campbell stepped forward with the moral authority that came with his position in the community. "Gentlemen, this is highly irregular behavior for any kind of official business. Interrupting a wedding ceremony to conduct railroad investigations suggests a level of urgency that doesn't match the nature of the allegations described." The pastor's intervention seemed to crystallize something in the gathering crowd. What had started as a few wedding guests had grown to include curious townspeople drawn by the commotion, and many of them were beginning to look skeptical about the railroad officials' timing and methods. "Seems mighty convenient that these urgent allegations couldn't wait until after the ceremony," Maggie observed loudly enough for everyone to hear. Almost like someone wanted to cause maximum embarrassment rather than resolve legitimate concerns. Emma could see Morrison beginning to understand that he'd been manipulated into participating in a personal attack rather than conducting a legitimate investigation. Victoria Ashford had probably presented him with carefully crafted complaints. That sounded official and urgent, without mentioning her personal animosity toward the people involved. "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Stone said, with the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with officials, "I assume the railroad conducted a thorough investigation before sending you here to disrupt a wedding ceremony. You've interviewed witnesses, examined evidence, verified the accuracy of the allegations." Morrison's silence was telling. It was becoming obvious that he'd acted on Victoria Ashford's complaints without conducting any independent verification. A procedural error that would reflect poorly on his own judgment and competence. Tom pressed his advantage. "Mr. Morrison, I've been station master here for 15 years without a single complaint in my personnel file. My efficiency ratings are consistently excellent, passenger satisfaction is high, and freight operations run smoothly. Mrs. Ashford's sudden concerns about my performance seemed to coincide remarkably with her personal disapproval of my marriage." "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Harrison," Morrison said, but his tone suggested he was beginning to see the situation more clearly. "It's also an accurate one," Sheriff Carter added. Mrs. Ashford has been quite vocal about her opinions regarding Mr. and Mrs. Harrison's relationship. Several people can testify to specific threats she's made about using her influence to cause problems for them. Emma watched Victoria Ashford across the street, noting how the woman's confident expression was beginning to show cracks as her carefully orchestrated plan started to unravel. Victoria had counted on the railroad officials accepting her version of events without question, but the public nature of the confrontation was forcing a more thorough examination of her motives and credibility. Perhaps, Pastor Campbell suggested diplomatically, this matter could be resolved through proper channels, with a formal investigation that includes all relevant parties and evidence. Surely there's no need to continue this discussion on the church steps during a wedding celebration. Morrison looked grateful for the opportunity to retreat gracefully. You're absolutely right, Pastor. Mr. Harrison, I'll be scheduling a formal hearing within the next 2 weeks. You'll receive proper notice and have the opportunity to present your response to these allegations. And I'll be requesting that Mrs. Ashford appear in person to substantiate her claims, Tom replied, along with any witnesses she claims to have and documentation of these alleged policy violations. As the railroad officials departed, Emma felt a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety. The immediate crisis had been averted, but the threat to Tom's career remained real. Victoria Ashford wasn't going to give up easily, and the formal hearing would require careful preparation and strong evidence to counter her influence. Well, Maggie announced to the gathered crowd, I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm ready for some wedding cake and hot coffee. Come on, let's get these newlyweds properly celebrated before anyone else decides to interrupt with urgent business. The reception at Maggie's diner was smaller than originally planned, but warmer and more intimate because of it. The confrontation with the railroad officials had actually strengthened the couple's support within the community, as people who might have remained neutral were offended by the obvious manipulation and poor timing of Victoria's attack. Emma found herself surrounded by well-wishers who offered not just congratulations but practical support for the challenges ahead. Dr. Stone volunteered to provide medical testimony about Emma's character and circumstances if needed. Sheriff Carter promised to document any further intimidation attempts by the Ashfords. Even people Emma barely knew expressed their disapproval of Victoria's tactics and their support for the young family. You know what this means, don't you? Tom said quietly as they stood together watching their children play with other young guests. That we're going to have to fight for our happiness. Emma replied. That we're not fighting alone, Tom corrected. Look around, Emma. Half the town is here celebrating with us, and they're not just being polite. Victoria Ashford's overplayed her hand, and people are starting to see her for what she really is. Emma surveyed the crowded diner and realized Tom was right. The attack on their wedding had backfired, galvanizing community support and exposing Victoria's true character. Instead of isolating the couple, Victoria had isolated herself, revealing the petty cruelty behind her claims of moral superiority. Over the following weeks, Emma threw herself into preparing for Tom's hearing with the determination of someone fighting for her family's future. She organized documentation of Tom's exemplary service record, collected testimonials from satisfied passengers and shipping customers, and researched railroad policies to ensure they understood the formal procedures involved. The hearing itself took place in the town hall, with territorial officials presiding alongside railroad supervisors. Victoria Ashford appeared as the primary complainant, dressed in her finest clothes and accompanied by Charles, who served as her chief supporter and character witness. But Victoria's carefully constructed case began to crumble under scrutiny. When pressed for specific examples of Tom's alleged misconduct, she could provide only vague accusations and personal opinions. Her claims about improper use of railroad property were contradicted by actual company policies that explicitly allowed station masters to provide emergency shelter for stranded passengers. Emma's meticulous documentation of Tom's service record, combined with testimonials from community members and railroad customers, painted a picture of an exemplary employee whose only crime was showing compassion to people in need. Even Supervisor Morrison, who had initially seemed sympathetic to Victoria's complaints, was forced to acknowledge that the evidence didn't support the allegations. The hearing's turning point came when Charles Whitman took the stand to support his mother's claims. Under questioning by Tom's advocate, Charles revealed the true motivation behind the complaints, admitting that his family had offered Emma money to leave town and had threatened Tom's employment when she refused. "So you're testifying that your mother filed these complaints after Mrs. Harrison rejected your family's attempts to bribe her into leaving Willowbrook?" the advocate asked. Charles realized too late that he'd walked into a trap. "That's not how I would characterize. How would you characterize offering someone money to leave town and threatening her husband's job if she refuses?" the advocate pressed. The room erupted in murmurs as the true nature of Victoria's campaign became clear to everyone present. What she had presented as legitimate concerns about professional conduct was revealed to be nothing more than a vengeful attack on people who had refused to be intimidated by her wealth and influence. The hearing concluded with a formal reprimand for Victoria Ashford for filing false complaints and wasting railroad resources on personal vendettas. Tom was not only cleared of all allegations, but commended for his exemplary service and professional conduct under difficult circumstances. But the real victory came later that evening, when Emma and Tom returned to their cottage to find a delegation of townspeople waiting for them. Led by Pastor Campbell and including many of Willowbrook's most respected citizens, the group had come to offer a formal apology for the treatment Emma had received and to welcome her officially as a valued member of the community. "Mrs. Harrison," Pastor Campbell said, speaking for the group, "we want you to know that Victoria Ashford's opinions don't represent this town's values. You and your family are welcome here, and we're proud to have you as neighbors." Emma felt tears streaming down her face as she realized that the battle was truly over. Victoria Ashford's attempts to destroy her family had instead revealed the essential goodness of the people around them. The community that had initially seemed threatening and unwelcoming had proven itself to be full of decent people who valued character over appearances and kindness over social status. 3 months later, Emma gave birth to a healthy daughter. In the cottage behind the railroad station, with Dr. Stone attending and Maggie serving as an unofficial midwife, Tom held his new daughter with wonder and pride, marveling at the tiny person who represented the future they had built together against all odds. Lucy and Sam adapted to their new sister with the resilience of children, helping with baby care, and proudly telling anyone who would listen about their perfect family. The cottage that had once seemed like temporary shelter had become a true home, filled with laughter and love and the comfortable chaos of family life. Victoria Ashford never recovered from the public humiliation of the hearing. Her influence in Willowbrook gradually diminished as people grew tired of her constant complaints and manipulative tactics. Charles eventually left town altogether, seeking opportunities in larger cities where his mother's money might carry more weight. Emma often stood at her kitchen window in the early morning, watching Tom direct the loading of freight cars and coordinate passenger arrivals with the same quiet competence that had first attracted her attention. The railroad station that had once represented the end of her dreams had become the foundation of a new life beyond anything she had dared to hope for. The mail-order bride advertisement that had brought her to Willowbrook still lay folded in her jewelry box, a reminder of how desperate circumstances could lead to unexpected blessings. Henry Mitchell's rejection, which had seemed like a disaster at the time, had been the first step toward finding the love and partnership she had never known she was seeking. Tom would often say that he had been waiting his whole life for Emma to step off that train, and Emma had come to believe he was right. Sometimes the most important journeys were the ones you never planned to take, And sometimes the best destinations were the places you discovered when everything else fell apart. Their love story had begun with rejection and hardship, but it had grown into something stronger than either had imagined possible. Emma had learned that true love wasn't about finding someone who completed you, but about finding someone who inspired you to become the best version of yourself. As she watched their children play in the snow outside the cottage and felt the baby kick gently against her ribs, Emma knew that she had found something more precious than security or social acceptance. She had found a home where she was valued for who she truly was, a partner who loved her unconditionally, and a community that had learned to judge people by their character rather than their circumstances. The station master's cottage behind the Willowbrook depot had become the center of a love story that would be told for generations, a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful endings come from the most unlikely beginnings, and that love really could conquer all when it was built on foundation of genuine respect, shared values, and the courage to fight for what mattered most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.